My name is Yosuke Okita. And yesterday I did a very similar presentation. So for those who attended yesterday's panel discussion might be boring, but I will try to finish today's presentation quicker and accept some questions. So today I want to talk about the certification systems for disaster and emergency management. And I want to compare the two Japanese systems and two international systems. So as you can see, recently, against big natural disasters, many international assistance teams, and in Japan, many Japanese volunteers are deployed to the affected areas. So some questions here: do they need to have a certification or license to work in disaster-affected areas? And actually, the answer is no. If the affected country's government accept them, say okay, they can be deployed. And then second question is, do we have international certification systems for disaster and emergency management, which I will discuss in this presentation? And if we should have a certification system, who can certify, or what are the requirements for these certifications? So in this presentation, I want to compare two Japanese systems and two international systems. The first one is Bousaishi, or Disaster Prevention Officer, and the Kiki Kanrishi, Emergency Management Officer, conducted in Japan, and the CEM, Certified Emergency Manager by IAEM, and the TQC, TIEMS Qualification Certification by TIEMS. And I selected these four certification systems based on these criteria, and they are certification systems for individuals, not teams. And basically, anyone can apply for these systems, and these are generally recognized in this field. So why we need a certification systems in this field? So after the Kobe earthquake in 1995, Japanese local government tried to establish some disaster management courses, but there are no unified name, no standard course of it. And in Japan, also international organizations involved in humanitarian assistance conduct their training for their staff respectively, but they are not structured, and they only issue a certificate of attendance, but not to pass the exam. And the standard is not clearly set by these organizations. So some issues needed to be considered here is inconsistent requirements for training content and skills, and how to maintain the quality of competence after certification, and the question of which organization can certify this competence. So Japan's two systems, the first system is Bousaishi, or Disaster Prevention Officer, is a system conducted by a Japanese NPO. And it started from 2003, and as of now, more than 240,000 people already certified. In order to be certified, applicants have to attend a 2-day training course and pass the exam, and attend some emergency life-saving course. And we have many training institutions for this Bousaishi. This is designated by this NPO, and the participants are mainly disaster prevention officers in the government, company, and the students, housewives, etc. And basically, anyone can attend this training course. So in the past, even elementary school students were certified in this system. And this is, once they are certified, there is no need to renew the certification. And the second one is a Kiki Kanrishi, or Emergency Management Officer. Again, this is a certification by the Japanese NPO, and it started from 2011. At first, it was done by an academic society, JEMA. And there are some requirements. Applicants have to attend a 3-day training course. Grade 2 is introductory, or a 4-day training course for grade 1, which is advanced course. And they also have to pass the exam. And grade 2 has two types. One is natural disaster, and the other is social risk course. And also, applicant must be a member of this NPO. And the training course for this Kiki Kanrishi is provided only by JIEM, this NPO. And the participants are mainly emergency management officers in the government and the companies. And this certification is valid only for 3 years. So once they are certified, they need to renew certification every 3 years. And the number of certified members are not released, but it should be much lower, probably 500 to 700, because training courses are organized, provided only by this NPO. And this CEM by IAEM is an international certification. So this is a certification by IAEM, which is an international NPO, and it started from 1993. And as of now, more than 2,500 people were certified in CEM and AEM, which is Associate Emergency Manager. And IAEM is an NPO, and it has more than 6,000 members in the US and worldwide. And it was established in 1952 at the US Civil Defense Council and became IAEM later. And they have to, in order to be certified, they have to submit some document and pass the multiple choice exam, which I will discuss later. And this certification is valid for 5 years. And the last one is TQC by TIEMS. And it started from 2020, and only 10 certified members in TQC and 1 in TQAC, which is TIEMS Qualification Associate Certification. TIEMS is an international NPO, which was established in 1993 in the US and currently is a secretariat in Belgium. Some requirements: applicants must submit the document and pass a multiple choice and essay exams. And the TQC is valid for 3 years. So some requirements for certification. So basically, Japanese two system, Bōsai-shi and Kiki-Kanri-shi, is open to everyone. So anyone can attend the training course and can be certified. For CEM, the applicants must have 100-hour training in emergency management and general management before applying for this certification. And they need to submit a reference letter from their bosses and the 3-year work experience, and they basically must have a bachelor degree. And other experience such as exercise participation and the teaching and the certification related to emergency management. For TQC, applicants must be a TIEMS member, and basically they have to have a bachelor degree or minimum 50-hour training in disaster or emergency management or a national level certificate. And they have to have at least a 3-year work experience, and other requirements such as international perspective and disaster prevention and recovery skills and knowledge are also needed in TQC. And this is a comparison of training curriculum and the contents of exam. So in Japanese two system, Bōsai-shi and Kiki-Kanri-shi, all the applicants must take the course developed by the NPOs. And so the skills required for certification are clearly set by the certification bodies, these NPO. And also the study materials, such as textbooks, are very well developed by these NPOs. And in my impression, they put more focus on natural disaster and its preparation. Probably because Japan is a very disaster-prone country. And regarding the CEM and the TQC, there is no need to take any specific course before the exam. And if you look at the IAEM and the TIEMS website, you can find some learning materials, but they are not very well organized. So the applicants must study these materials by themselves. And in my impression, they put more focus on management. So how to manage disaster after disaster strikes. And this page shows about the recognition and the evaluation of the certification. So all the 4 systems discussed here is certification by NPOs. So they are not official one by the government. And in Bōsai-shi and the Kiki-Kanri-shi, 2 Japanese systems, the recognition in Japan is increasing and it's actually very high. So this photo shows ID cards for Bōsai-shi and the Kiki-Kanri-shi. So if people look at these ID cards, people will recognize this guy has some knowledge in disaster and emergency management. But of course, this system is almost unknown outside of Japan. And the CEM is with more than 2,500 certified members. they have certain degree of recognition in US and internationally. But I want to point out that more than 90% of certified members are from the US. And for TQC, currently we only have 11 certified members. So I would say the recognition is still low, so we have to work on it. But the certified members, annual conference, and the board members are from various countries. So I think we can say TQC is more like an international system. And about the evaluation, it is up to the employers on how to evaluate these certifications. And also it depends on the disaster-affected areas if they want to accept or prioritize people with these certifications. So in conclusion, Japan's two systems, Bosaishi and Kiki Kanrishi, their focus is more on training. So the standards and the learning materials are systematically organized, but it's not an international system. And they put the focus on mechanism of natural disasters and its preparation. And for international two systems, CEM and TQC, their focus is on prove their abilities. So for those who already have rich work experience and knowledge in this field. And they put focus on management after disaster strikes, and CEM has a strong recognition, but relatively centered in the US. And the TQC is an international, very international certification, but I'd say the recognition is still very low. And all the four certifications discussed here by NGOs, so they are not the official one. So it's up to the employers or disaster-affected areas on how to evaluate for those who have this certification. And the last is my opinion. It is still, even if they are not the official one, it is still important for disaster responders like us to show we are the emergency and disaster management experts by showing these certifications. Okay, thank you very much. And that's all from my end. And if you have any questions, I'd like to accept it. Thank you very much.
Greetings from India to the respected chair, esteemed presenters, and august audience both online and offline. At the outset, I express my gratitude for the opportunity to present to the teams and also to the conference organizers. As is evident from my slide, the topic of my presentation today is socio-psychological impact of COVID-19 pandemic on children in India. The outline goes thus: introduction followed by research questions and methodology, discussion, conclusion, and at the end, suggestions and way forward. To begin with, as is the public knowledge, the COVID-19 pandemic caught us unawares, compelling the nations worldwide to grapple with a formidable adversary, challenging established norms and systems across various sectors. India, owing to its demographic diversity, with a substantial proportion of its population residing in densely populated urban areas and a significant rural populace, presented unique complexities in managing the virus's spread and mitigating its consequences. During the pandemic, much attention was directed towards addressing the immediate health and economic concerns, and a profoundly significant dimension, that is the socio-psychological impact on children, by all means constituting a highly vulnerable group with distinct needs and vulnerabilities, was rather less heeded too. The present study aims to shift the spotlight onto this vital facet, specifically those ranging in age from 3 to 14 years, their experiences, emotions, and challenges during this transformative period. It is also sought to unravel the complex web of related challenges triggered by the disruption of familiar routines and environments that children rely on for their development and emotional stability, as also to explore how these have impacted children across different regions of India, taking into account the diversity of socioeconomic and cultural contexts. This study may not only help in acknowledging the unique difficulties children have faced, but also pave the way for targeted interventions, support systems, and policies that aim to promote their well-being and resilience in the face of unforeseen challenges, ensuring we can better equip and empower the future generation. The research questions goes thus. What were the specific social psychological challenges experienced by Indian children in the selected age bracket? How did the social psychological impact of the pandemic on Indian children vary across different geographical regions and socio-economic backgrounds? What coping mechanisms did Indian children or their parents employ to navigate the emotional and psychological challenges? To what extent did disruptions in education, social interactions, and family dynamics contribute to the social psychological impact on the children during the pandemic? What role did access to technology and online resources play in mitigating or exacerbating the social psychological impact on children of India during the pandemic? The methodology adopted has qualitative approach. The research methods deployed are in-depth interviews, surveys, and observation. These samples have been selected through a purposive sampling method. The sample comprises children between 3 to 14 years of age across urban, semi-urban, and rural regions, encompassing low-income, middle-income, and high-income families. Efforts were made to maintain a gender balance within the sample. Talking about the impact dimensions, the various dimensions of the social psychological impact studied during the study comprise disruption of education, emotional distress, family dynamics, mental health challenges, and also the coping mechanisms. Discussing the disruption of education first. Many families falling especially in middle and low income status had limited access to devices, as they possessed only one basic smartphone, which even parents needed for work-related communication. This sharing of device with parents and siblings made it challenging for many students, especially in the rural regions, to attend online classes consistently. Further, inadequate internet connectivity owing to frequent disconnections, unreliability, slow speed made it difficult for adolescents to engage in live online lessons or access educational materials effectively. Besides, many middle and specifically low-income status households had a small, crowded living space and multiple family members attempting to work and study simultaneously, leading to loss of proper environment for learning. Also, online classes lack the personal touch and interactive teaching methods that children were accustomed to in physical classrooms, finding it challenging to ask questions or seek clarification from teachers. Then there was this loss of peer interaction, group activities, and social learning experiences, which left children feeling isolated and disconnected from their school community. All these challenges cumulatively led to significant learning gaps marked with concentration and concepts grasping issues during online classes. It has therefore been found that overall impact of disruption in education led to academic stress, exposed digital divide across regions, caused major learning loss, and social isolation. Talking about emotional distress experienced by children under selection. With the imposition of social distancing measures and lockdowns, children were suddenly cut off from their regular interactions with friends and peers. The absence of playdates, school activities, and face-to-face contact left children feeling isolated and disconnected, which in turn led to development of separation anxiety caused by extended isolation. As a result, children experienced a constant sense of sadness and loneliness, which adversely impacted their emotional well-being, which in turn had implications for education, which children finding it challenging to concentrate during online classes due to emotional turmoil, which further contributed to their academic difficulties. Considering the family dynamics, it was found that with schools closed and daycare services limited, the working parents had to juggle the demands demands of the jobs and the household chores with the constant needs of their children and childcare. This led to work-life imbalances. The demands of remote work often spilled into parents' personal life, especially the working mothers. They frequently found themselves working late into the night to meet deadlines and attend virtual meetings. This created a sense of constant tension and exhaustion, affecting their ability to be fully present for their children. It had a cumulative kind of effect in terms of strained relationships during the persisting lockdowns, with the children, especially in the crucial growing stage, missing the attention and quality time they used to have with their parents. The lack of emotional support and attention took a toll on children's emotional well-being, and the stress and tension at home affected children's mood and behavior, leading to frequent emotional outbursts. Many parents in such situations experience a deep sense of guilt and frustration or the unintended strain in parent-child relationship as a consequence of the pandemic's demands. This clearly highlights the intricate interplay between family dynamics and external stressors. What comes to fore as a result of disruption in family dynamics is parental stress, altered roles in terms of the shift in family roles and responsibilities, conflicts and tensions within families, disagreements and frustrations among family members had the potential to negatively impact children's mental health. Yet, there were many supportive families as well who engaged in activities along with their children. Strengthened family bonds and quality time spent together helped mitigate some of the negative effects of the pandemic. Coming to the mental health challenges, many children began to display concerning changes in their behavior, lost interest in activities they once enjoyed, and a pervasive sense of sadness seemed to envelop them with a noticeable change in their overall demeanor. And increasing withdrawal from family interactions and social connections was noticed in children by parents. They suffered difficulty in concentration on studies, found it challenging to focus on online classes and complete assignments, which further intensified their feelings of inadequacy. Alongside emotional distress, many children began experiencing physical symptoms such as headaches, stomachaches, nausea, weakness, which were the manifestations of their inner emotional turmoil. Alarmed by these changes, parents felt concerned and even sought professional help for their children. The coping mechanisms were multiple, which were adopted by parents and children. For the lower age group, it was basically the focus was basically the parents' perspective, and for the higher age group, they themselves wrote these coping mechanisms in along with the parents. Engagement in creative activities, outdoor activities, online social interaction, maintaining hobbies, mindfulness and relaxation techniques like listening to music, meditate, and etc. Support from family, staying informed about what is going around, helping others in need, maintaining a proper routine, adaptive learning, talking about feelings, seeking professional help, and engaging themselves in physical activity. These coping mechanisms helped in enhancing their creativity. It provided them an emotional outlet, gave them a sense of control and emotional resilience, and all this had a positive impact on their well-being. Not all was gloomy, and there was a flip side for some. They viewed the pandemic as an opportunity in adversity in terms of family bonding, resilience and adaptability, creativity and hobbies, empathizing and showing solidarity, treating it as multiple learning opportunities, strengthening of digital literacy, giving family time for educational and other recreational activities, reduced academic pressure, enhanced resilience and problem-solving skills, and in strengthening the family value system. Talking about geographical and socioeconomic variations as the determinants, the urban areas had better access to resources and technology, but restricted outdoor activities, which was just the reverse in case of the rural areas. Similarly, in case of hotspot regions, strict lockdowns and confinements caused greater anxiety as compared to the non-hotspot regions, where, of course, the daily routine got disturbed due to school closures and limited outdoor activities. On the side of the high, mild, and low economic status households, the flow of access to resources and adaptive facilities was evidently from affordability to non-affordability in the same order. Maximum setback was experienced by the socio-economically marginalized and vulnerable communities. Lack of access to education, nutrition, and safe environments caused severe socio-psychological implications to the children falling in these societal strata.
You've got 3 minutes left.
Yeah, I'll conclude fast. As goes the role of technology, it had both mitigating and exacerbating roles. In terms of mitigating, it led to continuity of education, provided social connection, learning opportunities, and creative outlets. Whereas, on the hindsight, it exposed digital divide, increased the screen time of children, led to cyberbullying and online safety, loss of physical activity, and caused parental stress. To conclude, the socio-psychological impact of the pandemic on Indian children was not uniform and varied significantly across various clusters and backgrounds. Understanding these variations is essential for tailoring interventions and support to meet the unique needs of children from diverse backgrounds. Disruptions in education, social interactions, and family dynamics were significant contributors to the socio-psychological impact on Indian children during the pandemic. Access to technology and online resources during the pandemic had both positive and negative implications for the children's socio-psychological well-being. Recognizing these factors is essential for policymakers, educators, and parents to address the digital divide, promote safe online environments, and strike a balance between technology use and well-being for children. So it is important that effectiveness of coping mechanisms, it was importantly noted that the effectiveness of coping mechanisms varied among individuals across the children's age, their personality, the support systems which were available to them, and the choice of coping strategies was all influenced by these factors. As for the proactive measures, improving online education access, expanding mental health support, promoting resilience building activities, supporting parental well-being are important. And a collective call to action is important on the part of policymakers, educators, parents, and a support system which can provide mental health awareness and promote resilience is important. For the way forward, comprehensive mental health support programs in schools are needed. Digital infrastructure needs improvement in terms of initiatives by government and non-government agencies, establishing parental support programs, incorporating resilience, building curriculum, and fostering community engagement. This is something which I look forward to. These are some of the references. Thank you for your patiently listening. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to speak at the conference today. It's one of the great things about talking about Africa. It's always a great delight to speak at a conference based in Africa, and it's also with great sadness that I can't be with you there today to talk about this. The title of the topic in question is the role and timings of meta-leadership, evaluating the Nova 2021 Wellington fuel tanker incident in Sierra Leone. And why is this important? Well, in many ways, it illustrates some of the dynamics in particular and uses two particular types of concepts, meta-leadership and single points of failure, to understand what seemed to be a major traffic accident but became a national emergency with a presidential report, and therefore something of significant interest both in Sierra Leone and outside. So I'll now move on. Basically, the first part of the presentation really is to outline, well, why is meta-leadership important, particularly in countries in Africa where there are scarce resources and where integrated disaster management systems are still evolving. And I think the first important point really is to, well, why are we looking at the notion of meta-leadership and what does it constitute? Well, the concept of meta-leadership is well developed in the literature, as you may know, from the leadership area, and Marcus et al., for example, in 2015 being one of those. And the important aspect of meta-leadership is, of course, as we know, is about the development of a leadership that brings together constituencies across a panoramic piece, and therefore is part of an integrated disaster management structure. One needs leadership to balance the effectiveness of structure. And in the African context, when structures are often evolving or underfunded because of scarce resources, like in Sierra Leone, then we have to focus also understanding where that leadership may fill in the gaps. So the fundamental question here is, what is the concept of leadership? Well, for this presentation, I think there's three important dynamics of meta-leadership that I would like to introduce for the discussion. The first is to help leaders navigate complex situations. So part of the notion of meta-leadership is not just about having assessment or situational awareness, it's also being able to navigate that landscape. Thirdly, by able to navigate that landscape, you're able to generate unity of action in bringing together different constituencies with often different motives, which must be focused into a broadly adopted strategy, plan, and mission, even if their priorities and proclivities are conflicting. And finally, to best align mission, strategy, tactics, and success metrics with the problems and opportunities that we face, particularly in relation to disaster management and its relationship with society. I think that's the important point to also mention here in relation to this. But for the part of this discussion, there are many aspects of meta-leadership, but I'm going to focus on three dynamics which are important for our understanding of this case. The first is that meta-leadership is built on the notion of people, that leaders and communicators, although we recognise that human capital is fundamentally important to the way we think about disaster management, leaders have to know their strengths and limitations, what they can and cannot do alone, and have to work with others in networks to be able to achieve effective response. So we need to focus on the notion of people within meta-leadership. Secondly, the notion of understanding situations. As we well know, in disaster management, situational awareness is key. But if one is developing a meta-leadership style to fill in gaps and also to support structures as they evolve, then one has to have very strong strategic situational awareness. And thirdly, if one has people and one has situations, one needs connectivity to bring them together. And that's to establish cross-cutting organisation communication channels and coordination where people don't operate and structures don't operate in silos, but operate together. And we need to think about this horizontally in terms of multi-agency between actors in our disaster management system, and also within intra-agency within our respective leadership functions as well. So it could be between ministries or within ministries, to use that very simple example of the way we might want to move this forward. And why is this important for the discussion that I'm taking here? Well, it just comes from really working in Africa for 20 years, but particularly in Sierra Leone for certainly 10 years. And I've been involved in projects in Sierra Leone since before Ebola and during Ebola in the 2014 to 16 landslides, COVID-19, and working with many actors across the piece. And the first important point really is to understand is that resilience in Africa, in my view at least, is often about human factors. That the local contexts are often challenging. The focus is very much often on reacting and response rather than disaster risk reduction because of scarcity of resource. And there's often asymmetrical position between having what might seem plans, often written by NGOs and other parties or governments, which might be pristine, and the realities on the ground of the scarce resources to be able to deliver them. So often the reality on the ground, where in Sierra Leone, most of your disaster response may be delivered by volunteers, is very different from one was expected from a planning scenario, or at least may not actually reflect it entirely. And therefore, timing is also variable. 72 hours for a response is at best is a good outcome in the Sierra Leone context, and often it takes much longer for that meta leadership to bear down. And therefore, resilience, in my view, is often agent-based in Africa, with the role of key gateworks and networks being very important in actually handling situations as they evolve. Therefore, the notion of leadership and meta leadership has to be seen in that constant dynamic as well. The other aspect, the second observation, is that resilience is often bottom up, in the sense that most of our career resilience of disaster management response require upon volunteer networks, on active communities, and where state provision and state intervention may be weak and often missing. And actually one talks about hybrid governance often in Sierra Leone, where NGOs often fulfill functions that the government doesn't actually deliver in its entirety. So we need to be very clear about that, because we often think about planning and actually how that may affect and influence our actors and networks. Whereas in practice, it may often be the case where we also need to think about it the opposite way around, how our networks can influence standard operating procedures, which are often guides and very different from the reality on the ground there. And the final therefore, is that often the focus when we talk about resilience in countries like Sierra Leone, with high levels of poverty and being highly disaster prone, is that we need to focus not on very large technological solutions, which may be expensive and hard to maintain, but we also need to balance in about targeting on practical single points of failure. Those aspects where managers in Africa can actually use the resources that they have to identify gaps, remove those single points of failures, and lead to major benefits in that way. So the second aspect that I want to introduce is the notion of single points of failure techniques. And this comes from a project called Africa, a project funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund, and Evaldis, a project that followed after it, which identified really and looked at simple single points of failure techniques, which policymakers can use at the national and local levels to provide commonality on what are the perceived single points of failure where actually the resources can make a difference and therefore will not lead to partial or immediate breakdowns in the disaster management system. And the outcome of this project in Africa was 3 years of field work across Sierra Leone, but it was all between 2019 to 21, so it covered the COVID years, and actually incorporating extensive interviews, focus groups, and also peer observations as part of the disaster response mechanisms at the national and community level, which was embodied in an Africa report of recommendations launched by the government in a partnership with the National Disaster Management Agency and Freetown City Council together to deliver that. And that was actually then implemented through a complex matrix across all governments to understand how meta leadership can address single points of failure in late December 21. And that was actually then adopted by the Chief Minister, the Prime Minister of Sierra Leone, leading to a full World Bank proposal for funding to achieve that. So in a sense, the research has actually led to practitioner elements. And that has actually been also quite extensive in terms of also leading to influencing the new National Disaster Management Agency set up in 2021 and its first year in 2022, where new standard operating procedures for disaster response were based upon those single points of failure. And also below that, at the Freetown City Council level, in the capital city with over 1.2 million people, looking at their standard operating procedures, and even to the point of standard operating procedures for the dump site staff in King Tom and Kissy, where there are major challenges and vulnerabilities which could lead to major urban fires across the city. The findings were this outlined in a report in October 2021, the AfriCAP report, which was based upon 559 participants, identified 12 cross-cutting single points of failure, and led to 8 thematic areas where these single points of failure were identified with 27 immediate actions. So if we think about balancing our notion of meta-leadership, what we need to identify with single points of failure, which provides in many ways the what or how that needs to be looked at, these two tools provide a mechanism to look at particular cases of how we might improve response and disaster management, both for government, for communities, and also for society. So what we're really arguing as part of this very simple model is that we recognise that there's a distinctive nature to African disaster management, high propensity for human interaction, bottom-up, single points of failure identification, and that therefore requires also for us to recognise that we need to identify what are the challenges. If we can identify what challenges are actual single points of failure, then we can develop a typology of which ones are resolvable, and by doing that, implement policy training and change to be able to deliver that. So what is a single point of failure? Well, for most people in the disaster management world, they'll be familiar with this in a sense, but single points of failure are actually often small, manageable, specific elements, which actually, if not addressed, can lead to failure in parts or all of the disaster management system. And equally, small measures or specific measures, often within the budgets of existing policymakers, communities, and so forth, if applied, can actually have an enhancing effect. So single points of failure can be a place, it could be a building or a situation or a location. So for example, in a study in the Caribbean, when we found that, for example, their National Disaster Management Agency was built in a building that was tsunami proof, but not hurricane proof. So when Hurricane Irma struck, it knocked out the building and therefore knocked out the response. We're going to often think about in terms of organisation teams, the human capital, training, the right numbers of people in the right areas, applications, but it can also be also missing standard operating procedures, policies, groups, finances, and so forth. But the other way to think about single points of failure is we don't think about them necessarily as being something that is always about a weakness or a missing element. It could be that a resource, because of a scarce resource, say in Sierra Leone, is so precious that if it is overwhelmed, then it leads to a breakdown of part of the position. So it can actually be a recognition of the importance of the system itself. But the AfriCAP work in particular identified also that we need a more sophisticated techniques to deal with single points of failure, and therefore a very simple terminology used for policymakers in terms of resolvable, residual, and resistance. And those are effectively resolvable ones. Those are where we can put resources in place. Maybe training, it may be equipment, it may be managerial reform that leads effectively to the removal of the single point of failure. Resource goes in, the single point of failure may be removed, it's fixable. And then we have those single points of failure where we can do the same thing. We will reduce the risk of it happening, but we can't remove it all. Those are the residual ones. And we have certain single points of failure that we just have to recognise that there is a ring fence or a parameter of what we can do in African disaster management. And if these single points of failure rear their heads, then disaster management will be compromised. So we need to be clear about what are those particular elements that we are talking about here. And the final aspect to also identify within the presentation is that there are different types of single points of failure. There are technical ones, procedural ones, human ones, economic ones, and financial ones. And you can see there the slide there, the kind of examples: health and safety standards, lack of missing rules, operating procedures, staff numbers, expertise, training, equipment, and it can be budgets that are all different types. Now, the important thing about this research is that it was also based upon effectively quite important field research where we conducted semi-structured interviews with key stakeholders at both the national and the international level, NGOs, ministries, responders to get their views on that. And in addition to that, we also had focus groups in all regions of the country as to what were the single points of failure. And this was also followed up in the Evaldis project with very detailed interviews around the Evaldis event around the Wellington fuel tanker incident to follow up where those single points of failure were felt to have a bridge. And the important thing about single points of failure is you don't need to have an event for policymakers to know what they are. Intuitively, they tend to, but it's also about understanding a consensus around that. And we're also part of the operational system of emergency response in the country at both the Freetown level and at the national level, in which we were providing peer observations with practitioners as to whether there were workarounds in place. And this led to this quite important report, the Africa Final Report in 2021, 559 participant outputs, 12 cross-cutting single points of failure identified, 8 thematic areas for recommendations, and 27 immediate action points. Now, why is this important? And I'm very conscious of time here, and I'm just going to spend 2 minutes. But basically what the report outlines is that actually what you actually see is the existence of 12 notable areas of clusters of single points of failure and a firm concerted basis of actions where 60 to 80% of the top spots were clearly identified at both the national and the local level with stakeholders. And what that means in practice is that there was strong consensus at both the national and the local level and across the piece that as to what were the single points of failure, a consensus for action and a consistency between the national and local level that actually single points of failure can be resolved. So 80% of them, as you can see on the bottom of the slide, were identified as being resolvable. And here you can see on this slide the 12 areas that were identified. These slides will be made available afterwards, and also a notion of how severe those single points of failure are and how scalable they are across parts of activities as well. And not surprisingly, you see some very large areas in relation to HR, for example, which supports the meta leadership case. We also see, for example, that when we look at this, that actually many of the single points of failure were also consistently at both at the national and the district level. And there you can see some of the identifications. So something like 80% of the top 5 are the same, and 60% of the top 10 are the same. Now, this has led to major work in relation to a facilitator's guide, where we were able to also get the local communities to think about what their single points of failure are, and therefore provide mapping around what are the single points of failure across the system. So by the end of the Evaldis project, we're able to identify what are the spots at the national level and down to the communities and even the wards and districts of Freetown, covering some 1.2 million people. Now, why is this important? Well, I just want to talk in my last 4 minutes about the notion of the Wellington fuel tanker incident. The Wellington fuel tanker incident took place in, as it said, in November 2021. It was where a fuel tanker ran into the traffic accident with a tipper truck, which led to a fuel spillage, a traditional road traffic accident. But unfortunately, what happened is that the tanker was stuck there for a long time, and local youth and local community members decided to try and take the petrol out of the tanker. One of them was smoking. It led to a major explosion and caused 154 deaths and 310 people being affected. And not only that, the hospitals and the responders were overwhelmed, and it led to a presidential task force commissioned in January 2022 to look at this was a national case of needing to do things better. And you can see on those slides some of the severity of the accidents, the lack of cordons, and so forth. Now, why is this important to bring this to a close? Well, in effect, the analysis of the case study of the Wellington fuel tanker illustrates exactly the point, that there were notable single points of failure. Firstly, an over-reliance on key people and human resources. The people factor of meta leadership and single points of failure coming together to lead to major problems with the over-reliance on key personnel. Limited and available NDMA staff available to deal with confusion on responsibilities and line management, issues to do with the lack of equipment and resources available to the National Fire Force, and weak command and coordinating structures at the scene. All classic examples of problems that you have, but here one would say most notably a real challenge about how we deal with an over-reliance on human resources. Equally, we see real weak situational awareness, the second part of our meta-leadership. The incident management response showed major deficiencies in terms of coordinating. There were real challenges around public pictures and public management of communication, and there was incident management of victims going to hospitals. Situational awareness was equally weak and a problem of siloed activities. In fact, there was 2 responses going on at the same time, one by the Ministry of Health and one led by the NDMA, illustrating how the situational awareness wasn't joined up, which brings me on to the third point, where the single point of failure was poor connectivity between the human and the situational awareness, leading to challenges of two responses that I've just mentioned, problems of battle rhythms, and an inconsistent use of online virtual platforms to be able to coordinate stakeholders. Now, why is this important for the way we think about this? Because when the Presidential Task Force published, I was able to give some evidence in relation to meta-leadership and single points of failure, and 10 of the 13 issues that were identified in the single points of failure of the analysis of the Wellington fuel tanker found their way into the final presidential report, illustrating the resonance with which the single point of failure argument. And part of it was argued that the fundamental recognition was there needed to be stronger leadership and coordination. So to bring this to a close then, in my last 1 minute, what we would argue effectively is that fuel tanker incident shows that basically there were real questions and inefficiencies in the meta-leadership picture coming from the fuel tanker incident. And we see failures across the human capital, the complex situations, the unity of action and the strategies, and we also see identifiable and resolvable issues with people, situational awareness and connectivity. And therefore, in terms of moving forward, the case shows that those single points of failure with coherent single meta-leadership would have led to a more effective response. And part of that presidential task force was learning those lessons for the future. We'll wait to see in practice whether that becomes the case. And with 3 seconds left, thank you for listening, for your time.
I'm Dr. Mark Ashipari, an Associate Lecturer in Environmental Management and an Affiliate Research in Disaster Studies at Northumbria University, located in Newcastle upon Tyne. As this is recorded, it means that for some reason something's gone wrong and I'm not able to join you this afternoon, which of course is regrettable. Today I'm going to talk about trust, truth, the nihilistic state and disaster risk reduction. Now, I first became interested in this research during my PhD in the late 2010s, when I noticed a small but quite vocal group of people kept saying the same debunked theory about climate change. Now, mixed in with what I've been observing in recent years going on in general society, I really became interested in this topic. Now, during my presentation, I want you to consider a few questions. First, do you think that society is becoming more nihilistic? Why do you think you think that, and have you seen that personally? The third question is, why do you think this is the case that we're becoming more nihilistic? And fourth, what impact could that have on DRR? The functionality of any society, especially a modern society, relies upon trust in our functioning institutions. This includes the media, government, and of course us, the research community. Now, the American economist and Nobel laureate Kenneth Arrow wrote in 1974 that trust is an important lubricant of a social system. It's extremely efficient. It saves a lot of trouble to have a fair degree of reliance on other people's words. Now, success in achieving our collective targets for humanity, including the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, will depend on civil society's trust in both the institutions and also, of course, their fellow citizens. Now, the American Psychological Association defines trust as the reliance on a confidence independent of someone or something. Importance of trust in both facts and data is vital. However, the opposite trend seems to be occurring in national political debate and discourse within civil society, which can be observed throughout the Western world, especially in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and France. Cavillak and Rich in 2018 believe that this is a symptom of truth decay. Now, they discuss the diminishing role of accurate facts in public life. They argue that there are 4 potential causes for truth decay to occur: cognitive bias, changes in information generated and shared, I'm going to explain that in a second, excessive demands imposed on the education system, but also political polarization, and we really have seen that in recent years. Now, one of the biggest changes in recent years is the way which society consumes its news. The internet has revolutionized the way in which the news is communicated to society. Previously, we were limited to TV, radio, and newspapers, which gathering the latest information about society, they were only updated periodically and were very limited in scope. The internet has allowed for rolling news to develop and allowed society not just to consume news in their own country, but allowed to consume it from other countries, thus increasing the scope of news in which people are consuming. However, the biggest change in which society consumes news is through the medium of social media. Now, social media are platforms in which information, ideas, thoughts are shared via a virtual networking site platform. And this can be done through writing, videos, or even podcasts. Now, some of the most popular examples are X, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. These platforms really became prominent in their usage in the early to mid 2010s and resulted in a significant amount of news being shared on these platforms. And this is partially attributed to traditional media utilizing these new emerging platforms to expand both the scope and the speed and the audience consuming the latest news. But it's also led to less credible news being shared on these platforms via citizen journalists and news outlets mimicking traditional news media. In 2020, Gallup poll demonstrated that 59% and 54% of Americans surveyed who regularly use social media stated that they use Twitter and Facebook to get the latest news about societal matters, including about COVID-19 and climate change. Despite this, in the same poll, 23% stated that when they use social media to find out new information, they are becoming increasingly confused about societal matters, and this is really becoming concerning. Despite the public having more information at hand than they've ever had, the public is becoming increasingly confused about these societal matters. And this is concerning when you think about the impacts, of society questioning trust when matters are urgent, such as when COVID-19 first emerged in 2020. It is arguable that one of the main causes of confusion amongst the public is the spread of fake news. Fake news, which is sometimes known as pseudo-news, false news, hoax news, can be defined as the fabrication of information that mimics news media content in form, but not organizational process or intent. So what that means is it does not have the same standards to ensure the credibility and accuracy of a news story. And it's important because we're starting to see an erosion of our defense walls against misinformation, and it's a global issue. Once fake news and misinformation starts to occur, you start questioning the trust on our institutions, and that really becomes an issue when you're trying to, fight disease, when you're trying to combat climate change, when you're trying to run a country. Now, numerous studies around the world have demonstrated that social media can contribute to the spread of false information and news to a wider public. Now, on Twitter or X, most of the false information and news originates from Twitter bots. Now, what we find is that it's very difficult to combat the spread of this because of the amount of information sources that we have, and also these social medias generate echo chambers that reinforces different people's beliefs. If they believe that and they see it, it reinforces that belief. Now, most of the misinformation is shared for societal reasons, just to get likes and just to get attention. What we find is that fake news especially is more common amongst older and conservative voters, especially for older voters. They might not realize this, share in something that's not quite true. Younger people generally have a better knowledge of how misinformation works. And with social media, what we have is that there is no peer review in terms of what is being shared. So there's so much we can't do that. And if you try to stop or take down something that isn't true, accusations of censorship are being thrown at these companies. So this all leads to nihilism. Now, nihilism is a philosophy of negation, region, or denial of some or all aspects of thought or life. So this could mean the rejection of objective truth, so that is truth free of biases, and that's typically our science is objective truths and objective knowledge, the rejection of knowledge, of facts and sciences, morality, what do we believe a society thinks is morally correct and incorrect, our values, what as a society we stand for, and also in the more extreme cases, the meaning of human existence itself. Now, nihilism is not a new concept. Nihilism as a ideological and philosophy concept really developed out of the start of the Age of Enlightenment in Europe. And we know that there are different broad types of nihilism. Now, when you consider the role of nihilism on disaster risk reduction, medical nihilism and therapeutic nihilism is probably one of the more important ones. It's not a new concept, medical and therapeutic nihilism. It's always kind of been there, especially when medicine was first really taken off. And we are starting to see this nihilistic trait really take off in the Western world during the COVID-19 pandemic. And examples of this have been the level of abuse and death threats against researchers and medical personnel, the burning of 5G towers due to the misconception that 5G caused COVID, the destruction of COVID-19 vaccines, and also shouting at people just for wearing a face covering, even though it's their personal choice. So currently this is a debate as whether society in the Western world is increasing the number of people who are showing nihilistic traits, or whether these attitudes have already become more emboldened during the pandemic and they were always there and it's fueled by social media. Now, an observation by myself is that I feel that the report of nihilistic attitudes, linked in the media has definitely increased since 2020. And I feel that there is an increasing number of people that are developing nihilistic traits in society. So very quickly, these are just some examples of what I feel are nihilistic traits that we have seen in the last 3 years. So the first picture here, and I do apologize if anyone's offended by it, is actually outside of a hospital not far from where I work in Newcastle, where they drew a Nazi symbol and said NHS liars because they were vaccinating people against COVID-19 at the time. The second one is the insurrection in the United States in 2021 is trying to overthrow a democratic leader. Correct. And finally, these ones where say vaccines cause injury and death, vaccine mandates violate body autonomy, and I'm not going to get into that debate today. So I want to move on to a case study now about nihilism, and I want to utilize the MMR vaccine. And so MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella. Now, of course, WHO recommends that all children should have 2 doses of the vaccine. And it's found that with these 2 doses, you've got about 97% effectiveness and protection against measles, 95% against rubella, and 88% against mumps. Now, it could be argued that MMR vaccine was one of the most important vaccines from the 20th century, with the vaccine first being made available in 1971 in the United States. Now, we had separate vaccines previously, especially for measles. Now, taking the case numbers of measles in England and Wales in 1941, we found that these 2 regions had nearly 410,000 cases that year of measles and 1,145 deaths. By 2019, the number of cases was down to 806, and the number of deaths were down to 5. So we had seen a decline of 99.8% in cases between the two periods. So this demonstrates that vaccines had actually both reduced the number of cases, thus reducing the number of people dying with this disease. In addition, England and Wales actually had 7 years where nobody has died of measles: 94, 96, 2003, 2005, 2010, 2014 and 2015. However, the credibility of the vaccine was damaged in 1998 amongst the public due to the incorrect linkage between MMR vaccines and regressive development disorder, most commonly autism, by Andrew Wakefield and 12 of his colleagues. Whilst this paper was redacted by the journal in 2010, it is still being cited as a main cause of autism amongst certain groups. Now, the paper had problems because it had a very small sample size, no design control, and was pretty much speculative in nature. Now, the paper did get a lot of attention in the media and really did cause a vaccine scare in the United Kingdom. So to give an example of this, the uptake of the MMR vaccine declined from 95% in 1995 to 79.9% in 2003-04. Now, we need 95% uptake to stop an outbreak of measles. Now, the issue with measles is that it's one of the most transmissible diseases that infects humans. To give an example of this, measles has an estimated R0 number of between 12 and 18, whereas COVID-19, and especially the original strain of COVID-19, had a reproductive number of between 1.4 and 6.7. So we're already looking at least twice as infectious. Now, this is another demonstration of medical nihilism. Despite Wakefield's study being proven to be incorrect and potentially fraudulent by numerous studies and numerous organizations, there's still a sizable proportion of the population still not willing to have their children vaccinated against the MMR vaccine. Now, due to this, the UK Health Security Agency has warned that London, which has the lowest vaccine uptake of the whole country, faces the prospect of a large outbreak of measles in the near future if vaccination rates do not increase. They estimate that we could see an outbreak of between 40 and 160,000 cases. This would put the UK having a case rate for measles similar to the 1980s. So why am I talking about MMR and social media? How does it all link? Because the MMR scare was, of course, back in 1998. Well, what I've done is I've kind of pulled out 5 bits here. So the first one here is the middle is if you go into X and start typing VACC to get vaccine, you get vaccine injuries, vaccine deaths, vaccine side effects as the first 3 things you find. Now, what I've also picked up is 4 examples of cases where people have linked vaccines, and especially MMR, with autism. This case here has had over 44,000 people view this one. The one in the bottom left has had 175,000 people. The one on the bottom right has had 1.1 million people viewing this. And the top right, which is Andrew Wakefield, again trying to save about autism and the MMR vaccine, has had 284,000 viewers. And to demonstrate how this is still having an impact, and this link about vaccines and autism, in 2021, YouGov did a survey with 1,490 Americans, and they were surveyed on various issues. One of the questions was, do you believe that vaccines can cause autism? What's kind of worrying is 18% of Americans believe this. Now that's a huge sizable proportion of people believing this. And what's more interesting is that those who didn't get vaccinated against COVID-19, nearly half of them believe this statement. So where does all this leave for disaster risk reduction? Well, when we come to a disease's prospect, we're starting to lose some of the progress in dealing with these diseases that we've been making over the last 50 to 60 years. I mean, in the UK, as I mentioned, we've seen a potential soon to go back towards the 1980s and lose all the progress we made with the measles outbreaks. I think of the case in the United States where we've now seen at least one case of polio, a disease that's almost, extinct in the United States a few years ago. I think of, COVID-19, and I think of, when disease X comes in the future, and it might be more deadly than the COVID-19, we've just had. Will people listen to our advice anymore? But also, what's next for climate change? Climate change is not immune to this, and I started, all of this by researching climate change, and that's what dragged me into this nihilism concept. And there's a lot of misinformation going on about climate change at the minute on social media, and climate change is probably one of the biggest threats for the 21st century that we have to deal with. And how do we stop a runaway climate when people have nihilistic attitudes? Thank you very much for watching.